Okay, so let's continue. This is part 2 of Carl Jung's book on ion, on the shadow. Let's see. Whereas the contents of the personal unconscious are acquired during the individual's lifetime, the contents of the collective unconscious are invariably archetypes that were present from the beginning. Their relation to the instincts has been discussed elsewhere. The archetypes most clearly characterized from the empirical point of view are those which have the most frequent and most disturbing influence on the ego. These are the shadow, the anima, and the animus. The most accessible of these and the easiest to experience is the shadow, for its nature can in large measure be inferred from the contents of the personal unconscious. The only exceptions to this rule are those rather rare cases where the positive qualities of the personality are repressed and the ego, in consequence, plays an essentially negative or unfavorable role. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. This act is the essential condition for any kind of self-knowledge, and it therefore, as a rule, meets with considerable resistance. Indeed, self-knowledge as a psychotherapeutic measure frequently requires much painstaking work extending over a long period. Closer examination of the dark characteristics, that is, the inferiorities constituting the shadow, reveals that they have an emotional nature, a kind of autonomy, and accordingly an obsessive or better possessive quality. Emotion, incidentally, is not an activity of the individual, but something that happens to him. Effects occur usually where adaptation is weakest, and at the same time they reveal the reason for its weakness, namely a certain degree of inferiority and the existence of a lower level of personality. On this lower level, with its uncontrolled or scarcely controlled emotions, one behaves more or less like a primitive who is not only the passive victim of his effects, but also singularly incapable of moral judgment. Right? So he's saying there are certain parts of you that you wouldn't want to know about. Let's say you're capable of killing someone. These dark sort of things that you don't want to know about, and you repress them. You would like to believe that you're a good human being, right? You would like to believe that you're not like others, but it could just be that you're ignoring certain qualities, negative qualities that you have within you, and if you ignore them, then you're not conscious of them, and therefore you can't really control them. That's what Jung is saying. He says at the lower level you behave like a primitive. Like, it's true. Imagine if you get really angry. When you get really angry, you behave like a primitive Stone Age person. Zero control. So Jung is saying there's no self-knowledge without dealing with this issue, without recognizing the dark qualities of yourself, and that can be really painful sometimes. Although with insight and goodwill, the shadow can to some extent be assimilated into the conscious personality, experience shows that there are certain features which offer the most obstinate resistance to moral control and prove almost impossible to influence. Look. Certain features which offer the most obstinate resistance to moral control and prove almost impossible to influence. These resistances are usually bound up with projections which are not recognized as such, and their recognition is a moral achievement beyond the ordinary. While some traits peculiar to the shadow can be recognized without too much difficulty as one's own personal qualities, in this case both insight and goodwill are unavailing because the cause of the emotion appears to lie beyond all possibility of doubt in the other person. No matter how obvious it may be to the neutral observer that it's a matter of projection, there is little hope that the subject will perceive this himself. He must be convinced that he throws a very long shadow before he is willing to withdraw his emotionally toned projections from their object. This is really important. What he's saying is sometimes you project certain qualities that you have in you into the other person, and because these are the negative qualities that you have, these are the qualities of the shadow, you project them onto the other person, and then you end up hating the other person without understanding that the quality that you projected onto the other person is actually your own quality. Your own quality that you are not conscious of. And in some sense, I think whenever you project something externally, this is the way the unconscious is trying to make you conscious of it. Right? It makes you project it first, and then you should study the projection and trace it back to yourself. Right? This is why they say that if you really hate something about someone, you really should reflect. Maybe you have that quality within yourself. Right? So we should look at hate as an indication that something external is really internal. If you really hate something external, there's a good chance, like hate is like a red signal, there's a good chance that, hey, you might have that quality in you. Right? Like, for example, sometimes you will see some parents, who hate certain qualities in children. Like, for example, a father might look at his child and recognize that certain qualities in the child he hates it about them. That child maybe is not a lucky guy, he's not hardworking, it doesn't matter. And if the father really hates that quality about the kid, I think the father should really take a look at himself and realize whether he should fix these qualities in himself first. Maybe he has these qualities in himself. Maybe he's projecting these qualities onto his child. Right? So like there is some work to be done here. Whenever you hate the quality about the other person, I'm not saying that you have that quality yourself, but there is some room for reflection that maybe you do. Let us suppose that a certain individual shows no inclination whatever to recognize his projections. Right? Like some people project and then screw it, right? Like it's impossible to convince them that they projected. The projection-making factor that has a free hand and can realize its object, if it has one, will bring about some other situation characteristic of its power. As we know, it is not the conscious subject, but the unconscious which does the projecting. Hence, one meets with projections, one does not make them. The effect of projection is to isolate the subject from its environment, since instead of a real relation to it, there is only an illusory one. Projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. Look, this is important. Projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. That's key. I have, let's say, my own face, part of it I know, the other part of it is the shadow, right? Like, let's say I know this part consciously, and the back is the shadow, I don't know. Projections usually take contents from the shadow, your unknown face, and project it into the world. Projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. Right? Interesting. In the last analysis, therefore, they lead to an autoerotic or autistic condition in which one dreams a world whose reality remains forever unattainable. The resultant sentiment, the incompletude, and the still worse feeling of sterility are in their turn explained by projection as the malevolence of the environment, and by means of this vicious circle, the isolation is intensified. The more projections are thrust in between the subject and the environment, the harder it is for the ego to see through its illusions. A 45-year-old patient who had suffered from a compulsion neurosis since he was 20 and had become completely cut off from the world once said to me, "But I can never admit to myself that I have wasted the best 25 years of my life." Damn. A 45-year-old patient who had suffered from compulsion neurosis since he was 20 and had become completely cut off from the world once said to me, "But I can never admit to myself that I've wasted the best 25 years of my life. Damn. It is often tragic to see how blatantly a man bungles his own life and the lives of others, yet remains totally incapable of seeing how much the whole tragedy originates in himself and how he continually feeds it and keeps it going. I mean, this is crazy. This is crazy. Look, not consciously, of course, for consciously he's engaged in bewailing and cursing a faithless world that recedes further and further into distance. Rather, it is an unconscious factor which spins the illusion that veils his world, and what is being spun is a cocoon which in the end will completely envelop him. I mean, this to me is really important to keep in mind. I know people in my life who, as Jung is saying, they have like this relation to their environment as if everyone hates them, as if whatever happened to them in their life is everybody else's fault, because nobody helps them. But if you look deep down, the whole tragedy, as Jung says, originates in that person. Right? Like they just keep projecting so much that, as Jung is saying, at some point the reality becomes obscure. Everything that you see is just your own projection at some point. And what is happening beyond your projections, no, you have no idea. And so then, that gets very dangerous, very quick. It is very important to trace back the projections quickly, I think. But I think all of us know how difficult that is, not just with ourselves, but if you see a person who clearly is projecting, it is near them impossible to convince the person that they're projecting. Because the moment you tell them they're projecting, they get angry. Why? Because you're tapping into the instinctual parts. Right? They don't want to hear about these things. And if you think logic will help, you're mistaken. You haven't dealt enough with these people. If they're projecting, there's nothing will help them. No logic. The only hope they have is themselves, of becoming conscious of the fact that, hey, maybe it is not the other person's fault, maybe I'm projecting. If they are not capable of becoming conscious of that themselves, you have no hope. If you think you can talk to them logically and convince them, good luck. Right? One might assume that projections like these, which are so very difficult, if not impossible to dissolve, would belong to the realm of the shadow, that is, to the negative side of the personality. This assumption becomes untenable after a certain point because the symbols that appear no longer refer to the same but to the opposite sex, in a man's case to a woman and vice versa. The source of projections is no longer the shadow, which is always of the same sex as the subject, but a contrasexual figure. Here we meet the animus of a woman and the anim of a man, two corresponding archetypes whose autonomy and unconsciousness explain the stubbornness of their projections. Though the shadow is a motif, as well known to mythology as anima and animus, it represents first and foremost the personal unconscious, and its contents can therefore be made conscious without too much difficulty. In this, it differs from anima and animus, for whereas the shadow can be seen through and recognized fairly easily, the anima and animus are much further away from consciousness and in normal circumstances are seldom, if ever, realized. With a little self-criticism, one can see through the shadow. So far its nature is personal, but when it appears as an archetype, one counters the same difficulties as with anima and animus. In other words, it is quite within the bounds of possibility for a man to recognize the relative evil of his nature, but it is a rare and shattering experience for him to gaze into the face of absolute evil. Look, this is important. In other words, it is quite within the bounds of possibility for a man to recognize the relative evil of his nature, but it is a rare and shattering experience for him to gaze into the face of absolute evil. That is interesting. When Jung is talking about anima and animus here, they are like, I am a man, and inside my psyche there is the feminine part, right? That would be my anima. And in every woman, within her psyche, there is a masculine part called the animus. And so Jung is saying that the shadow is personal, more or less, and sometimes you can trace these projections back, but when the projections are coming deeper into the unconscious from your masculine part of the psyche or the feminine part of the psyche, then it is a bit harder to trace back, and it is a bit harder to retract those projections. We will learn more about anima and animus in a bit, but Jung is letting us know that tracking back the projections is not so easy. It's not so easy, because a lot of times you don't even know what the origin is. So he's saying, like, if you want to look at the origin might be absolute evil itself. How can you look absolute evil in the face? You can't. So yeah, then this is part 3. Let's read this a bit also. How long is this anyway? Let's see, 11, 12. This is a little bit longer. Damn. Yeah, maybe I'll make a separate video about this.